Good morning. Today I'm thinking about the question that gets asked on courses. How do you explain that solution focus works? And answering that is not dead straightforward. It's not easy. We could start from questioning, well, do we know it works? And obviously, in relation to any one particular referral, even if the outcome is great, we can't really know that we've done anything useful. Since what we know is that, let's say, 30% of people left on a waiting list will improve. So this person that we've just seen, who came with a problem and left without one, perhaps this person is one of those 30%, one of the ones whom, if we had left them on a waiting list, they would have improved anyway. We can't even know for sure that we haven't slowed the change process down. Maybe they'd have changed quicker if they hadn't seen us. However, when we begin to put together cohorts of clients, groups of clients, and people we work with, and what we notice is that the outcomes that people report are better than the 30% that we could attribute to the waiting list, then we have to assume that we're doing something useful. So how do you explain that something useful? To some extent, Steve DeShazer and his colleagues at Milwaukee didn't really help us with that. Or you could say they were incredibly generous in the way they treated this question. Because what Steve would always say when asked, what's the theory of change? In other words, why does it work? Steve would say there's no theory. He would describe solution focus as a description and implicitly a proposition. It was a description of what they did at Milwaukee when they sat with clients that worked, and the proposition is, you try it, it may work for you. So actually, in the early days of solution focus, there was no theory at all beyond a very, very basic idea derived perhaps from the Mental Research Institute and their work at Palo Alto, that human behavior is patterned, and that when we do things that potentially interrupt the pattern, then new possibilities emerge. And of course, that would fit with the strong emphasis that Steve DeShazer always put on end of session, as he would call them, and we wouldn't, tasks or homework. So the session was involved in gathering information, largely, in order to shape a task. And through the doing of the task, we created the possibility for change. But even in Steve's writings, we began to see something different happening. And what we began to see were an increasing number of references to social constructionism, radical constructivism, and Wittgenstein's language-based philosophy. And implicit in these references, perhaps more than implicit at some level, was the idea that human beings construct their realities, if we can call them that, in language, in conversation, in social interaction. That we create reality through words. We create meanings. Meanings aren't out there to be found, to be discovered. We construct them and we create them. And as soon as Steve made this shift, of course, what he began to do I think, was to increase the emphasis on the conversation that takes place in the session, what's actually going on in the session, and perhaps the significance of out of session just a little bit, not totally, but a little bit diminishes in some way. So what is it that we were doing in the session that is beyond just gathering information? It's beyond that. We make a difference through the questions that we ask people. The questions, you could say, become the intervention, rather than a source of information for the worker. As soon as we get to this, we begin to see some different ideas about why does it work emerging. And I guess that actually it's very, very hard to use a therapeutic model day in, day out at work. And however much the model tells us, the approach tells us, that there's no theory underpinning this, it's very hard, human beings what they are, being what they are, it's very hard for little mini theories not to develop. And the way that the mini theory develops actually co-constructs. It influences, that's the word I was looking for, it influences the way we use the approach. So if the idea that we have is that, as in the early days of Steve DeShaze's thinking, that we are changing patterns of behaviour, then of course there's likely to be a larger emphasis on tasks, on homework, on questions that actually help us to understand, well, what is going on and where are the possibilities for a useful task. Now, that probably is no longer the way that I would think about change, and my way of thinking about change over the years has changed. But the way that these days I tend to think about what's going on in our approach is that we are working with people's attention. That every question that we ask people invites them to focus their attention in a particular way, to look at this rather than that. And as we focus people's attention through the questions that we ask, as we invite them to focus their attention through the questions we ask, then clients begin to notice different things, and we invite them to see significance in those new and different things that they're noticing. So through this process of shifted attention, different noticing, people seem to begin to reshape, to reformulate their, if you could say, relationship with the issue that's bothering them. They begin to contextualize that in a way that changes the problem domination, perhaps, that they have been experiencing until then. And in a more general way, as they do that, people begin to reach, inevitably, different conclusions about who they are and who they can be. And it is through that reshaping of attention, this new and changed noticing, I think, that change appears to happen. And of course, what that means for me is that the word noticing has become very, very central to the questions I ask. So as you wake up on a morning when you're feeling better about yourself and liking yourself more, what's the very first thing you'll notice? And what will you notice about the way that you're doing that? the word noticing has become very important to me and very central.